agreed on this. It is stated in Note 507. Thank you very much. I give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. Thank you, Mr. President. Once again, I reiterate that we're not aware of this note. And I believe this is unjust. To impose these restrictions is unjust. And it actually unveils a number of points that I'm going to refer to in my statement anyway. I hope everybody is patient to listen to my statement on behalf of my country. I'm not going to present a personal statement. Everybody spoke on behalf of their governments, and I'm here to speak on behalf of my government. And I encourage you all to listen carefully to what I have to say. Mr. President, I speak to you today while hundreds of rockets and mortars are targeting the capital Damascus in this very moment. Up till now, the injured amounted to 37, among them 6 children. 2 children were killed. This does not come as a surprise. As you know, every time the Security Council held a meeting to discuss the Syrian situation, we needed to have a massacre here and an attack there, and the killing of civilians in some Syrian cities. We've seen not dozens, but hundreds of massacres over the past 7 years. I think the radar of Mr. Lowcock did not catch those messages. Mr. Lowcock just didn't receive the view of the Syrian government that we have expressed in hundreds of letters that we sent to him and to you.
السيد الرئيس كل من استخدم كلمة نظام في هذه
Mr. President, some members are not objective, are not neutral, are not impartial. Whoever asked for a point of order showed that it is involved in the developments in my country. We thank the delegation of the Russian Federation for calling to hold this open meeting to give us the opportunity once again to present the reality of the suffering of civilians as a result of the practices of armed terrorist groups. Excuse me, of course I mean moderate armed groups, moderate armed opposition, that over the past 7 years has been sowing death and destruction wherever it operated. It used civilians as human shields. It targeted schools and hospitals and turned them into military centers. It has been hurling missiles and rockets indiscriminately at residential and populated areas. Of course, this is a form of resistance, as we've heard from the permanent representative of France before he left this meeting. He referred to them as resistance that the Syrian regime is trying to suppress. This meeting is particularly important as some actors, especially the United States of America and the so-called international coalition, these actors moved from the stage of proxy aggression through supporting terrorism to the stage of direct aggression. Those actors recruited terrorists from all 4 corners of the world. They called them jihadists and sent them to Syria. Whenever a terrorist failed, these actors were present militarily, politically, through the UN and through the media to intervene and seek to achieve what its terrorist proxies failed to achieve. Let's be clear here. Some council members, and I specifically mean the United States of America, the United Kingdom, and France, would like to deprive the Syrian government from its constitutional and sovereign right of defending its territories and people, a right that it stated in the Charter, back then when we had wise founding fathers and international law. And all UN resolutions on counterterrorism state that right. Today I heard you speak of a draft resolution on humanitarian issues. The penholders are Kuwait and Sweden, and I thank him for their efforts on this draft resolution over the past weeks. However, this effort is deeply flawed. You did not coordinate with the Syrian delegation at all. You didn't even ask to hear our view on a draft resolution on my country. Let's imagine for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, that hundreds of terrorists has used Bois de Boulogne as a center to target civilians in Paris, using dozens of missiles every day. Do you think we would have seen a draft resolution calling for a humanitarian truce to give the moderate armed French opposition the opportunity to regain its power and launch missiles targeting Paris? Let's imagine for a moment that hundreds of terrorists have used Central Park here in New York as a center to target civilians in Manhattan and launch dozens of missiles every day. Do you think we would have seen draft resolutions calling for medical evacuations of moderate armed American opposition? Let's imagine for a moment that hundreds of terrorists used Hyde Park in London as a center to target civilians in London every day with dozens of missiles. Do you think we would have seen draft resolutions calling for delivering humanitarian aid to moderate armed British opposition? Would we have seen statements by High Secretariat officials, such as Mr. Lowcock, calling for stopping the fight against armed groups and describing them as non-state armed opposition groups? Unfortunately, this is how UN documents refer to terrorists nowadays, non-state armed opposition groups. Mr. President, of course, these are all hypothetical scenarios that might seem far from the reality. However, it is the reality in Syria, a tragedy that we're seeing in Syrian cities every day, including the city of Damascus. It's a bitter reality that the Syrian government is facing as a result of erroneous approaches adopted by the United Nations and positions of some countries. Damascus is one of the oldest populated cities in history, as you know. It is seeing destruction, death, and sorrow every day as a result of missiles, mortars, and rockets launched by armed terrorist groups operating in eastern Ghouta. They are terrorist groups that are designated as terrorist groups in the United Nations, ISIS, al-Nusra, and affiliated groups. Today, 8 million people live in Damascus, among them hundreds of thousands that fled armed groups that attacked their villages and homes in many parts of Syria, including the eastern Ghouta. The United Nations today is going through a professional and moral crisis that is unfathomable. High Secretariat officials find no harm in adopting the positions of governments that sponsor terrorism in my country. They are directly involved in distorting facts, manipulating figures, using insidious phrases and terminology, and relying on unreliable sources in its statements and reports. Of course, I can't present all those scandals today. I will only remind you of the report of the Fact-Finding Mission, FFM, that was issued in June 2018. Document S/1510/2017. This report stated that among the open sources that it relied on is a testimony by British doctor Shagul Islam. For those of you who don't know who Mr. Islam is, he's a foreign terrorist fighting for Al-Nusra Front in Idlib. He's previously convicted in the UK. He was not allowed to practice medicine in the UK as he was involved in terrorist crimes. For instance, involved in kidnapping British journalist John Cantell. This is only an example. An example of the misleading reports of some of the UN Secretariat documents. We are convinced that these abhorrent practices will not stop and that some UN officials will ignore the serious information that we convey to it concerning the following. Armed terrorist groups made up a fictitious story indicating that the Syrian government used toxic chemical substances against civilians in Ghouta. These groups are training their members to pretend that they've been exposed to toxic substances. Of course, these scenes are broadcasts, and the Syrian Arab Army is blamed for it. We conveyed hundreds of letters to the Secretary General, to the President of the Security Council, and to specialized UN agencies on counterterrorism and the prohibition of chemical weapons. However, we are confident that some in the United Nations will not hesitate in adopting those tales and in blaming the Syrian government. This is simply because the power dynamics and agendas in this organization compel some to join the extortion of the Syrian Arab Republic and its allies that are fighting terrorism. Fighting terrorism on behalf of you all. Mr. President, the Syrian government for over 2 months now has been sending almost daily letters to the Secretary General and the President of the Security Council, documenting the number of missiles that have amounted to, in the past few weeks, 1,200 missiles. We have been documented the human and material casualties and civilian casualties in the city of Damascus as a result of being targeted by terrorist groups in eastern Ghouta. However, the Secretariat has no problem in ignoring the suffering of 8 million people in Damascus in its statements and appeals. It has not hesitated in participating in the misleading campaign launched by some countries to protect a few thousands members of terrorist armed groups in eastern Ghouta. So they're sacrificing 8 million civilians in Damascus to protect a few thousands in eastern Ghouta. International and United Nations sources are spreading news of a stifling siege on eastern Ghouta. This is not consistent with the reality on the ground. We're talking here about a lively, vital area that is the main source of food to the city of Damascus. Commercial trucks have been moving constantly between Damascus and eastern Ghouta. The Syrian government has facilitated the delivery of humanitarian aid to people in eastern Ghouta, as long as conditions on the ground allowed. We've also approved medical evacuations to government hospitals in Damascus. The truth that we all know, that High Secretariat officials know, is that terrorist armed groups are those who control humanitarian aid that enters eastern Ghouta. It is those groups that distribute this aid. There's another truth that the Secretariat is ignoring. Residents of eastern Ghouta has taken to the streets, protesting against the practices of terrorists that pointed their guns at the innocent people. Of course, these besieged innocent people are also sending messages, but the radar of Mr. Lowcock is not catching those messages. I would like to ask the Secretariat, how does it justify ignoring the reports and information that the Syrian government presented on hostages and kidnapped people detained by terrorist armed groups in eastern Ghouta at the so-called At-Tuba prison. They need immediate medical evacuation. The United Nations is ignoring video footage posted by armed groups showing that women and children of those hostages are being pushed into metal cages and left on the street. It is a painful scene that is reminiscent of the times of slavery. This is true insanity that the Secretary General has spoken of yesterday. Of course, there is terrorist insanity that we're witnessing in eastern Ghouta, and we must put a stop to it. What is even worse is that some in the Secretariat are trying to use the agreement on de-escalation zones to distort the facts and to ignore repeated violations perpetrated by terrorist armed groups. They're being instructed from the outside, from actors that are present in this meeting. They're instructed to target Syrian military sites and launching attacks using rockets, missiles, and car bombs on the residential neighborhoods in Damascus. Mr. President, groups operating in eastern Ghouta are terrorist armed groups, regardless of how they change their names, regardless of their affiliations and their allies. Today, we're talking about Jaish al-Islam, Al-Rahman Corps, the Dawn of Islam Corps. Yesterday, we were talking about the Islamic Front, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and Al-Nusra Front. I invite you all, ladies and gentlemen, to take a look at the websites of these jihadis. Take a look at satellite TV channels that Western satellites are helping to broadcast. You will see that they all share the same Wahhabi terrorist ideology. They all call for takfiri ideas and call to annihilate the others. Any attempt to change nomenclature will not change reality. It will not prevent us as government and with support of our allies, prevent us from defending our citizens in implementation of your resolutions on counterterrorism. Mr. President, some who are among us today are using the suffering of the Syrian people and are trading with their blood. They're demanding accountability while they're supporting terrorism. They're directly involved in military aggression against my people, as was done in Palestine, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Africa, and Latin America. The dilemma that we're facing today is that the mechanism of work inside the United Nations is being held hostage to financial and political polarization. As a result, the United Nations is completely disregarding the crimes of the so-called international coalition led by the United States of America. As my colleague from the Russian Federation said, this coalition completely destroyed Al-Raqqa. It killed hundreds of civilians, destroyed infrastructure and bridges over the Euphrates River in many areas of Syria under the pretext of fighting ISIS. It used internationally prohibited weapons against civilians. Of course, we've seen that in Vietnam. This is what the United States has done in Vietnam. Those are the weapons that were used in Vietnam. It targeted Syrian armed forces and allied forces more than once to lift the siege on ISIS. This coalition and its militias actually reached a deal with ISIS so that ISIS fighters, their families, and their heavy weapons could leave Raqqa. The United Nations is completely disregarding repeated aggression by Israeli occupation forces on the territories of the Syrian Arab Republic as part of its support to armed terrorist groups. The DPKO has no idea of what is going on in the Golan. The United Nations itself is completely disregarding Turkish violations to Syrian sovereignty and its direct military aggression on Afrin. I don't think any of you has addressed this issue in the statement. In conclusion, Mr. President, to respond to those who fear that Eastern Ghouta might become a second Aleppo, I invite you to go today to Aleppo and see with your own eyes how millions, not thousands, millions have regained their normal life after Aleppo was liberated from terrorism. Yes, Eastern Ghouta will become a second Aleppo. Idlib will become a second Aleppo. All areas suffering from the terrorism of armed groups will become the second Aleppo. Because we will not succumb to those who have supported terrorism in Syria. We will not be complacent to the plans of the governments of five countries that met in Washington last month to divide Syria and to ensure the failure of the Sochi conference and the failure of the Syrian process as a whole. This piece of news was unveiled today in the UK. We will not be passive towards those who use terrorism and unjust economic measures against the Syrian people and use military aggression to achieve cheap political agendas. I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that very soon, history will show that we and our allies have fought a war on behalf of the whole world against terrorism, supported by governments that will be held accountable by its people and the world. Those governments have invested all they had in terrorism and threatened its own cities, its own citizens, and in all parts of the world. When I look at some of the faces in this council and become aware of the political hypocrisy, I think, and I remember the famous saying by the great Russian writer Dostoevsky. He said, "Rest assured, hell is big enough for all. It doesn't deserve all this fierce competition on who will be the worst." End of quote. Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the representative of this